So today we'll be talking about the chosen people, and this is perhaps one of the most talked about, interesting, captivating, controversial subjects that keeps coming up. So we'll start with who were the chosen people, and what was the context for being chosen, and then what was the accountability or obligations for the chosen people. Moving on to do they still maintain that status to this day? And in the end, we'll wrap it up by what's in it for everybody else, for the entire world on this important subject. So starting with who were the chosen people, when we get to 247 in the Quran, it's very clear that Allah is reminding Bani Israel about his favors and the fact that he preferred them over everybody else, and literally chooses the word worlds or universes. So, he placed them right at the top in terms of being the preferred people. Now, before we go into Bani Israel, it's important to remember that just like Abdullah, or is in Arabic means the servant of God, and it's a very popular nickname in the Arab community. Similarly, in those days, the predominant language was Aramaic, and in the Aramaic language, El or Elohim or words like that refer to God or Allah. And so Israel means the same thing. It's a servant of God. And this was a nickname that was basically given to Prophet Yaqub. So when we say Bani Israel, we're talking about Bani Yaqub actually, because Israel was the nickname of the Prophet Yaqub. And if you remember, Prophet Yaqub Islam had 12 sons, and then there's the famous story of Yusuf Islam and all the other messengers. So, so that is basically Bani Israel. And so Allah chose them or preferred them over the others. Now, what did it actually entail? Or what was the preference based on? Okay, so we find a number of verses in the Quran. So there's a primary context which tells us that a number of messengers were sent into Bani Israel or Bani Yaqub, as we know from the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. Yusuf was one of the messengers, and then there were a number of others that followed in that family. And of course, Musa alayhi salam was another prophet, was one of the main prophets that was eventually sent to Bani Israel. So the primary context was related to the messengers. And then there's a secondary context which is actually very interesting. And that kicks in at the time of Pharaoh. Okay? So Bani Israel, in the time of, by the time they were in Pharaoh's era, ended up being the slaves of Pharaoh, right? And so they were going probably the harshest possible or the worst form of slavery perhaps known to mankind, because their children, as soon as they were born, the male offspring were just killed, and the women were kept alive. So they they were the Bani Israel was basically ruled with a lot of intimidation and horror. So that was they were, in a sense, you could say in those days, in the time of Pharaoh, you could say they were the lowest of the low. And so, interestingly, Allah decided to turn that around completely, because He can do what He wills. And this is also very evident in one of the verses of the Quran, where Allah says, وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا. And we decided to, bless the people who were oppressed big time. وَنَجْعَلُهُمْ أَئِمَّةً. And we just switched them into leaders. وَنَجْعَلُهُمُ الْوَارِثِينَ. And they were basically, Pharaoh and his tribe obviously got completely drowned, and these were the people who sort of took over. Okay, so that's another context of being chosen. Now, once they were chosen, The big question is, was there any obligation or accountability connected with being chosen? And this, of course, goes back to the covenant that Allah had with Bani Israel, or is the Ten Commandments. So they were made to promise a number of different things, starting with believing in the oneness of God and not ascribing any partners to Allah, and then looking after your parents and being good to people, and it continued on and on in terms of the Ten Commandments, which are obviously mentioned in the Torah, and they're obviously mentioned in the Quran as well. So that was the covenant. So essentially, it was to lead the world with God's message and with moral values. And but unfortunately, what happened after that was, as we can very clearly see in the Quran, and of course also in the Old Testament, is that they lost track of it, and they forgot the fact that they were rescued from Allah, miraculously from the painful punishment of the Pharaoh. And it was just a matter of time before they started worshipping the cow or the heifer, and they did a number of different things which were contrary to all the values that were taught to them. Okay. And so eventually what ended up happening was, of course, there's the stories are there in the Quran and the Old Testament, and I think most people are aware of it. But the status of the chosen people that was given to them was taken away very swiftly. And on the contrary, it was replaced with, there's a verse in the Quran which says, فَبِمَا نَقْضِهِمْ مِيثَاقَهُم, because of the fact that they broke their promise. لَعَنَّاهُمْ, we cursed them. وَجَعَلْنَا قُلُوبَهُمْ قَاسِيَةً, and we hardened their hearts. يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ عَن مَوَاضِعِهِ, and they started changing the book of, the message of Allah. So that was one of the worst, punishments, besides the fact that the Ashab al-Sabt, the one that they call Sabbath nowadays, which is Saturday, or in Arabic it is still called Sabt, where they were told not to, go fishing and just rest. But they sort of tried. They thought they were hoodwinking God, and they came up with a plan to cast the nets anyway. And they said, we're not fishing. And so Allah turned them into. There's a verse in the Quran which tells us that Allah turned them into monkeys and pigs. Some of those people. So the fall from grace, happened sort of very rapidly. As soon as they left, they started going against the commandments of Allah, rather than being the chosen people. The ones who disobeyed, which was obviously the majority of them, ended up being cursed. And this is not just in the Quran, this is, I guess, in the Old Testament as well, where even the Prophet Isa alayhi salam, he was one of the people who came, Jesus, who came to tell them that they were on the wrong and they were doing all the wrong things. And so they were cursed. The Quran says this, and the Bible also says this. They were cursed, through Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, in terms of, because of the wrong stuff that they did. So that was very briefly the background and the reality of the chosen people. And I guess now the big question is, why is this story so important? Why is this something that we need to know? And if you look carefully, this is one of the stories in which there's a lot of there's a lot of guidance for mankind. Okay, we can learn a lot from this. So Bani Israel is actually a subset, obviously, of Bani Adam, and so this is saying, in a sense, it is almost telling Bani Adam that just like Allah created Adam with his own hands, and made him superior over everything else. And of course, as soon as Adam disobeyed, then he was sent down to earth and so on. So essentially, it's basically reinforcing the same concept that Allah does not have a problem. Allah starts with placing people, whether they're tribes or people or individuals, in the best possible, let's say, format or place. And then it depends on the person whether he chooses to go on the right path and lead the path which takes him to the blessings of Allah, or he chooses the path which takes him down to the darkness of being misguided. So I hope you learned something from this session, and until next time, Assalamu alaikum.